It's March 24th, 2003. We have Francis Brown, whose birthday is May 27th, 1926. Her current address is 309 Shinneman Drive, Columbia City, 46725. We are at the Peabody Public Library, and the person doing the interview is Janet Skank. Francis, why don't you go ahead and start with what you have, some of your remembrances there, and then we will go from there.
1940 seems ages and ages ago. And yet when I think about it, it was only yesterday. I was sitting in a 9th grade class in Pineapple, Alabama. The class was a Latin class. We were not in the war yet, but our friends of Great Britain, people in Great Britain, were. And the children in America, especially in my part of the country, had been asked to knit mufflers to put around the necks of the British Air Force, the RAF. We learned a great deal of history this way and geography because the teacher pointed all the places out on the map on that dingy old wall in that schoolroom. I had never had knitting needles in my hands before, and I remember that the boys especially found lots of interesting things to do with the knitting needles rather than knitting. But they got down to it too, and in that Latin class we were just knitting away on those mufflers for Britain as we conjugated those Latin verbs, amo, amas, amat, da-da, da-da, and knitting away these long, dark khaki-colored mufflers. They were, it seems to me they were about 5 feet long. I'm not really sure of the exact length of them, but we felt that we were doing something for Great Britain. And then came 1941, and our country was at war. I remember our youth group going all over the countryside. Now in Pineapple, Alabama, there were a lot of junky places out in the fields and along the cotton fields with scrap metal. And our youth group spent many Saturdays trying to gather the scrap metal for the war effort. And then there were the long lines for stockings, meat, all kinds of things. And I remember one long line that I got into in Montgomery, Alabama, when we had gone up for a visit to the big city. And there were several lines, and I got into one and I thought it was for stockings. And when I got up close to the front, it was the wrong line. It was the line for meat. And that was one thing I did not want to have anything to do with, because I lived on a farm and there was butchering going on all the time, and I didn't want any part of meat. I wanted those beautiful stockings. And then I remember we saved our sugar stamps and we pooled them as families, and we would have like one big birthday when we saved enough extra sugar stamps so we could make this big cake for the family. There were so many other things, but I'm sure other people have told all those things about the home front. But one thing I will never forget, it was our custom. We were supposed to listen to all the newscasts on the radio, and some of us still had, the ones who lived outside of town where there was no electricity, still had the battery radios, those big old ugly things. And the ones who lived in town had, of course, electricity that ran most of the time. And we were expected as children or young people to be on that front porch as soon as supper was over. And my Uncle Wiley, who was so up on everything and followed every step of chasing Rommel across North Africa, he had a big map on the porch, and he moved those pins where our troops were every day. Sometimes it would only be an inch, but he knew how far our troops were advancing. And I was lucky, I guess, to grow up in a family where people were interested in what was going on in the world and the welfare of other people, even though we lived in a town of about 400 people in rural Alabama, where most of us had never been very far away from home. Perhaps 60 miles was it. So at 16, I knew that the next year I wanted to get out of Pineapple and go away to college. And since I was going to need money, I took a test at an airfield with the government, and I guess I must have had a photographic mind, because I could remember with tearing down the small airplane engines, the AT-6s, which were trainers. I could remember how to put it back together because I could remember how I took it apart, and I could do that very quickly. But so far as knowing what the parts did or how it kept the plane running, I have no idea. But they gave me a job, and I could tear down an 18-6 engine and do whatever had to be put back in, and so I was, I guess, an airplane mechanic at that early age. And the next summer, I was hired back at the same airfield, and this time I talked the boss into just letting me see if I could taxi one of those planes just a little ways. And I'm sure this was against all government regulations, but he let me do that. And pretty soon they had me taxiing those AT-6s into position from the hangar out to the line where the test pilots would be taking off and testing those planes. Thought that was a pretty big responsibility, and I just felt so glamorous at 17 to be doing that. And of course, my other job was to check out the radios to make sure that the radio apparatus on the AT-6 was reaching the tower and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not one bit mechanical minded, and my children, when I tell them that I did this during the Second World War, they look at me and aghast, and they say, "Mother, and the United States won the war with you as a mechanic?" So that's been a family joke. I guess living through those times did change our lives, because it gave us a much broader view of the world, not our narrow little world, that there were other people, other human beings that had the same basic wants and desires as we did. And after the war and after college, things went on pretty much as usual. The world became a whole different place. From that moment on, it just seemed to change so quickly, with new ideas, new gadgets, new apparatuses, and just a much calmer life than before.
Okay, can I just add just a few questions to add to that? You said you were 17 when you worked on you were 16 when you started, and then 17, and what year would that have been?
I began, let's see, I believe, but I won't say for sure because I don't have a pencil and paper here, but I was past 16, going on 17, and then 17 going on 18. And so that would have been 1942 and 43.
Okay. Did you do that? Did you continue to do that?
No, that was during the summertime, making money to go to college the first time, and then between my freshman and sophomore year, I graduated from high school early. One reason for that was not that I was brilliant, but my principal, remember all the young men were going off to war, even when that last year of high school. They were enlisting right and left. Pineapple was just a harem of women, of girls. And so my principal took me in the office one day and said, Frances, you have enough credits. Would you like to graduate a year early? So I skipped 11th grade. And so that's why I was so young doing that. But the government didn't seem to mind that I was very young. It was what you scored on the test. And I guess my ability in talking them into giving me a job that I needed if I was going to get a college education.
And did you go after that, once you got out of high school, did you go on to college? Because it seems to me the war was still going on.
Oh, yes.
When you left high
yes.
school.
I went to, I graduated from college in 1943 and went right on to college. But between that summer after graduating from high school is when I was working on the airplanes.
And then after you got out of college, what did you do?
Well, of course, while I was working at that airfield, I met a very handsome and delightful young man who was testing those planes that I had worked on, and there were a lot of jokes about he was scared to take up any plane that I had touched. But we got married, and we were married for 26 years and had 3 children.
But you were married during the war? War was
Yes,
still
we were
going on.
married in 1944, and he left for Europe for 18 months with the Air Force, and I was in college, and of course we were writing letters back and forth every single day.
How did you keep in touch? Let's talk a bit about your family life itself. Were there many people in your family that were actually serving in the war?
Oh yes, cousins. Well, and you know, a Southerner has cousins 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. Doesn't really matter. You're all family. But many of my first cousins, they served in all branches of the service.
And how did they keep in touch with their families and with you? I mean,
We had something called V-mail. It was one of those little fold-up letter kind of things with APO boxes, and everyone shared letters. As soon as Great Aunt Minnie got a letter from anybody she knew, we all shared letters.
you've touched upon saving your sugar rations.
Yes.
You touched about that. What other kind of things were rationed?
Like I say, I wasn't in charge of food. The older people were in charge of food, but I remember sugar, and I didn't drink coffee at that time, so it didn't much bother me. But I know that coffee was in was very rare, and rubber for rubber tires. You thought before you jumped in the car and went anywhere. And of course, gasoline, your gasoline stamps. And so we did a lot of walking between cousins' houses and aunts' and uncles' houses because the car was saved for only emergencies.
How about, you said they did do some recycling of the rubber because that was very important. Things like grease. I've heard that you had to save grease.
Grease from cooking?
Uh-huh.
Yes, but I can't really say.
You weren't involved in that.
Because when you live on a farm and you butcher pigs, there's a lot of bacon cooked. And so there was always a quart jar on the side of that big old black stove where you poured the extra bacon grease. I don't know what they did with it, but I know it was used to season black-eyed peas and turnip greens. And oh, did it taste good, because we had no thought of cholesterol in those days. But all of those relatives lived to be almost 100.
What about the social activities, the kind of things you did for fun down in Pineapple?
Well, Pineapple didn't have a theater. When we went to the movies, it was about 6 or 8 of us in a car to take one car, and usually that was about once a month. And we went to a little town called Greenville, Alabama, on Saturday. And that's when they had the serial, that carried on from one Saturday till the next. And of course there was always a Hopalong Cassidy movie or Gene Autry. And we would just go and time ourselves to be there. I think it cost 10 cents. and we would be there when the theater opened, and we would just stay and see it over and over. And we had to be home before dark, but we got our 10 cents worth. Oh, yes, and there were always dances. There was one lady in my hometown that son was away in the Marines, and Miss Georgia thought that we should all just carry on and be as happy as we could in spite of the war. And so even though most of the boys, available boys, were gone, she got the men around town to teach us girls how to dance. And she just cleaned out all the furniture in this big back room at her house, because houses were big in Alabama. And she had the Victrola, and she got the fathers and the aunts, the uncles, to dance with us, because so we wouldn't miss out on that social grace, I guess she called it. It was very interesting. And then the church, the youth groups, had box suppers where the young girls fixed the prettiest food, but not a basket, but it was a box. Little dainty sandwiches with the crust cut off and all kinds of pretty foods. And then it would be tied up with a beautiful, the prettiest bow you could find. And then maybe there would be some fresh flowers stuck in the bow. And then the boys would bid on the box, supposedly not knowing which girl brought it. And then they would have go off in the garden, and most of the houses had big gardens with garden paths, and would eat supper with the girl. And I was never really sure, because I didn't think about it at the time. I was more interested in who I was going to eat supper with and who was going to buy my box than I was what they did with the funds. Now, whether the funds went for any war efforts, I really can't say. I must ask somebody.
Before we end, how about, let's talk about the end of the war. The end of the war?
Yes.
Do you remember where you were? Now, you were married by this time, right?
Yes.
Okay. Where were
but
you?
My husband was still overseas. He was over there for the Army of Occupation and didn't return until 1946. So at the end of the war, all of the celebrations that went on, I had visited some people in Buffalo, New York, when the war in Europe ended. And I remember people on the streets just laughing and dancing, and a lot of kissing and hugging going on. And I had never been kissed by anybody except after my husband, and he's in Europe. And I remember a great big sailor grabbed me and whirled me around. I do remember that. But I remember the joy and the celebrations and the sounds and the shouts of joy.
Wonderful. Well, you've had some very interesting things to say. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at all?
Well, I haven't really thought about it, but the first thing that comes to my mind, that here we are in the middle of another war. And of course, after the Second World War, my brothers went away to the Korean War. My cousins, here again we lost family members. And then the Vietnam War, and the first Gulf War, and now here we are again. It seems that we'll never learn. But I think we've come a long way too in learning to respect others. And hopefully, someday, we'll be at peace.
Frances, thank you for sharing all your recollections. We will send this on to where it goes, and good job.
Thank you.